It was a quiet night, or at least it should have been. The stars hung lazily over the plains of India, but inside a makeshift tent, somewhere near the ancient city of Umarkot, chaos unfolded. A baby's cries mingled with the nervous chatter of midwives and soldiers. That baby, born under a canvas roof, in the middle of a battlefield, would one day become Akbar the Great. Now, you may think you've had an inconvenient birth. Maybe your parents forgot the hospital bag, but Akbar, he arrived in the middle of a military retreat, during a storm, while his family was fleeing for their lives. You probably wouldn't have survived that. Share your location and your local time in the comments, too. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Akbar's birth, in 1542, was a surprise in more ways than one. His father, Humayun, the Mule Emperor, was on the run from a rebel, Sher Shah Suri, who had snatched away much of the Mule lands. So, Akbar's first cradle wasn't a royal nursery, it was a simple tent, with the smell of wet earth and the distant sound of sword clashes. His mother, Hamida Banu Begum, cradled him while servants whispered about omens and stars. Even as a newborn, Akbar seemed destined for unusual adventures. Historians still argue whether Akbar's early years shaped his future temperament or if he was simply born bold. Either way, his first years were marked by a life on the move. When Akbar was just a toddler, he was left behind in Kandahar while his father tried to reclaim Delhi. Imagine that, being a royal baby, but also kind of forgotten in the shuffle of empire building. As Akbar grew, he wasn't exactly a bookworm. In fact, he never properly learned to read or write. Instead, he had a fierce curiosity that couldn't be contained by textbooks. His tutors tried, how they tried, but Akbar preferred to chase animals across dusty fields and wrestle with boys twice his size. He had a soft spot for animals too. Once, he reportedly tried to ride a buffalo like a horse. It didn't end well. There's also a story, though historians love to debate it, about how Akbar, as a child, befriended a pet cheetah named Maiden. Supposedly, he would sneak away from lessons to play with it, much to the horror of his tutors. Whether it's true or not, it fits the pattern. Akbar was a boy who didn't like to sit still. By the time he was 10, Akbar had seen more chaos than most of us will in a lifetime. Battles, betrayals, and the loss of his father's empire, these were his bedtime stories. But in the quiet moments, under starry skies, perhaps he stared at the same moon we see tonight and wondered what kind of ruler he would become. Akbar's childhood wasn't exactly a peaceful game of marbles. From an early age, he was treated less like a royal prince and more like a rugged little soldier in training. The adults in his life seemed to have one rule: if you're old enough to walk, you're old enough to learn how to survive in a world of sharp blades and sharp tongues. By the time Akbar was 5, he was already learning how to handle weapons, tiny bows, and blunt little daggers. He wasn't reading storybooks at bedtime. He was out on horseback, watching hunting parties chase deer across the plains. Imagine a 5-year-old today doing that. Historians still argue whether this intense upbringing shaped Akbar's later genius, or if he was simply born with an iron will. Either way, he didn't spend much time learning his letters. There's a story that once, Akbar's tutor tried to sit him down for a proper lesson in Persian poetry. The young prince, barely able to sit still, apparently yawned so hard he tipped over his ink pot and then chased a butterfly straight out of the tent. The tutor, exasperated, probably went home to tell his family that teaching Akbar was like trying to teach a tornado to read. But it wasn't all chaos. Akbar did love hunting. He had a particular fondness for leopards, yes, leopards, and would watch them stalk prey in the tall grasses. It's said that once, during a royal hunt, Akbar threw a tantrum because he wasn't allowed to wrestle a half-grown leopard cub. His guards had to pry him away, explaining that no, a prince cannot fight a leopard barehanded, no matter how brave he is. You probably wouldn't have survived that either. As he grew, Akbar's love of the wild stayed with him. He once tried to design a flying chariot by tying large kites to a wagon, just to see if the wind would carry it across the plains. It didn't work, obviously, but it shows you the kind of child he was: curious, fearless, and always ready to test the boundaries. The adults around him had mixed feelings. Some thought he was reckless, others admired his boldness. His grandfather, Babur, had been a warrior king too, so perhaps the family thought this was just the way mule boys turned out. Still, It's easy to imagine the royal court, sipping sherbet in the evenings, whispering about the wild boy who would someday be their ruler. Akbar's mother, Hamida Banu, was one of the few who could calm him down. She would tell him stories of Persian heroes and tales of the prophet's kindness. It's said she even once bribed him with a sweet mango just to get him to sit through a lesson. Historians still debate whether Akbar's famous tolerance for different cultures came from these early tales or if it was simply his own broad mind at work. By the time Akbar turned 10, he was already known for his sharp instincts. He could spot a hawk in the sky before his hunting companions and predict the path of a charging boar. And yet, for all his physical prowess, he still couldn't read a proper manuscript without help. A contradiction, for sure, but that's Akbar. As the seasons shifted and Akbar grew into his lanky preteen years, the empire around him buzzed with tension. You can picture courtyards full of murmuring advisors, servants scuttling past with platters of dates and almonds, and somewhere in the middle, young Akbar, sitting cross-legged on a rug, trying to look serious while a courtier drones on about taxes. His tutors hadn't quite given up, but they'd realized this boy wasn't going to sit quietly for lessons on Persian poetry. So, they tried a different approach. They let him learn by watching. Akbar's father, Humayun, had returned to power in Delhi after years of exile. It was an unstable time, with rivals lurking and ink still drying on peace treaties. Akbar's lessons became practical: watch how a court works, how alliances are built, and perhaps most importantly how not to get betrayed by your own relatives. Historians still argue whether this hands-on education was brilliant parenting or sheer luck. But it worked. Akbar absorbed knowledge by osmosis, picking up courtly etiquette, the rhythm of politics, and even how to tell when someone was lying just by watching their eyes twitch. Imagine a child today learning negotiation techniques from a room full of bickering uncles and generals. It might sound like a recipe for disaster, but for Akbar, it became a kind of schoolyard. One of his earliest political lessons came when his father fell ill. The empire held its breath, wondering who would rule if Humayun didn't recover. Akbar, still barely a teenager, stood by quietly as powerful men debated his future. It's said that during one tense meeting, an uncle suggested that Akbar be sent away for his safety, which was a polite way of saying let's get rid of the boy before he's a problem. Akbar didn't say much, but his sharp eyes didn't miss a thing. He also learned about military strategy. He watched generals map out battle plans on the floor, using stones and twigs. One day, when a particularly complicated siege plan was discussed, Akbar leaned over, pointed at a weak spot in the enemy's formation, and asked, "But won't they just attack from here?" The room fell silent. The generals looked at each other, realizing the boy had spotted a flaw none of them had noticed. And then there were the fringe tales, the odd little moments that made Akbar's learning unique. Like the time a visiting scholar showed him a mechanical bird, one of those early automata that flapped its wings and chirped when wound up. Akbar was mesmerized. He asked the scholar a dozen questions. Could it fly higher? Could it deliver messages? Could it attack someone's ear? The scholar, flustered, could only stammer. It's a small moment, but it shows how Akbar's curiosity roamed far beyond the politics of the court. Of course, not everyone loved Akbar's growing influence. Some courtiers whispered that the boy was too bold, too free-spirited. They didn't know whether to fear him or laugh at his antics. There's an old tale, probably exaggerated, that Akbar once tried to sneak into the armory and load a cannon, just to see what would happen. He was caught, of course, and the cannon was never fired. But you can almost picture the young prince, grinning like a mischievous cat, as the guards scolded him. By the time Akbar turned 13, the empire was bracing for change. He had no formal schooling in the usual sense, but he had been trained in the art of survival. He could read a court like a hunter tracks an animal. And that, perhaps, was the most valuable lesson of all. Akbar was about 14 when he faced one of the wildest moments of his life, the day he wrestled an elephant. Now, let's pause for a moment. If you've ever had a hard time parallel parking, or struggled to swat a fly, just imagine trying to fight an elephant. You probably wouldn't survive that. The story goes that in the royal stables, there was a particular elephant named Hawaii. Hawaii was known for his foul temper and tendency to charge at anyone who dared come near him. He had already caused quite a bit of chaos, knocking down fences, scaring the stable boys, and once even chasing a poor cook up a tree. You'd think most people would keep a safe distance from a creature like that. But not Akbar. One afternoon, as the story goes, Akbar decided he'd had enough of the elephant's bad behavior. He was determined to show the court that he could handle anything, even a raging elephant. With a grin that probably made his advisors sweat buckets, Akbar mounted Hawaii and urged the elephant into the courtyard. You can imagine the gasps, the servants diving out of the way, and the noblemen holding their breath. As Hawaii began to rear and trumpet, Akbar clung to the beast's neck, steering him away from the stables and toward an open field. Dust flew, herds scattered, and the elephant's feet thundered like drums across the earth. Akbar stayed balanced, barely shouting commands and laughing like a boy on a carnival ride. Historians still debate whether this entire event was a staged show of courage or an impulsive act of teenage bravado. Either way, it worked. After what must have felt like an eternity, Akbar brought the elephant under control. The court erupted in applause, and Akbar, dismounting with a dusty robe and a wild grin, became a legend in that moment. From then on, even the most hardened warriors treated the young emperor with a new kind of respect. And let's not forget the little details that make the story almost unbelievable. It's said that after the incident, Akbar rewarded the elephant with a garland of marigolds and a special feast of sugarcane and sweet rice. Apparently, Akbar believed in keeping his giant, dangerous friends happy. The elephant, for its part, became unusually loyal to Akbar and never threw a tantrum again. Whether that's a case of genuine animal affection or just exhaustion, historians still argue. The episode cemented Akbar's image as a fearless leader, someone who didn't just talk about bravery, but lived it. And while we might chuckle today, imagining a boy clinging to an elephant's neck while his turban flies off in the wind, for the people of Akbar's court, it was a moment of pure, heart-pounding awe. It's also a reminder of the strange mix of danger and playfulness that defined Akbar's early years. One minute, he was playing a game of chess with courtiers. The next, he was charging into a courtyard on the back of a rogue elephant. You just never knew what the young emperor would do next. And perhaps, that unpredictability is part of what made him such a fascinating figure. After the wild elephant ride, Akbar wasn't just a young prince anymore, he was a boy who had tamed the beast. And in the eyes of the mule court, that counted for something. But life wasn't all heroics and daring stunts. Soon, Akbar found himself thrust into a much weightier role, ruler of an empire that stretched across hundreds of miles, filled with diverse cultures, rival clans, and more political drama than a modern soap opera. And he was only 13. When Akbar's father, Humayun, died unexpectedly. Some say he slipped on the steps of his library while carrying an armful of books. The empire faced a moment of terrifying uncertainty. Historians still argue whether Humayun's death was a tragic accident or something more suspicious. But either way, Akbar suddenly became the emperor, 13 years old, barely able to write his own name, and already in charge of millions of people. You probably wouldn't have survived that either. Of course, Akbar wasn't exactly alone. His mentor and protector, Behram Khan, a seasoned general with a thick mustache and a stare that could freeze a tiger mid-pounce, acted as his regent. Behram Khan was the real power behind the throne at first, making decisions, handling rebellions, and keeping the ambitious nobles in check. Akbar watched, listened, and learned. But even as a teenager, he had his own ideas. One story from this time tells of a court meeting where a noble complained about the heavy taxes being imposed on the villagers. Akbar, listening quietly, suddenly asked, "If they are my people, why should they suffer?" It's a small moment, but it shows the early spark of the ruler. He would become someone who cared, at least in principle, about justice. Historians debate whether this was just youthful idealism or a genuine sense of fairness, but it's the kind of detail that sticks in the story. Meanwhile, Akbar was also learning the art of military command. He would ride out with his generals, observing their tactics, asking questions about supply lines, and even suggesting clever tricks like using camels to block enemy cavalry charges. Some of his ideas were dismissed as childish, but others were brilliant enough that his generals took note. There's even a tale, possibly more legend than fact, that during a skirmish, Akbar dismounted his horse and personally fired a cannon, just to prove he could. His life wasn't without its odd little details, though. Akbar, for example, was fascinated by birds. He kept pigeons, partridges, and even peacocks in the palace gardens, and he would spend hours watching them, sometimes sketching their patterns in the dust with a stick. One scholar visiting the court described Akbar as a boy with the heart of a warrior but the patience of a heron. A strange mix, indeed. But being a teenage emperor wasn't all fun and games. Akbar had to navigate a web of family intrigues, jealous nobles, and even a few assassination plots. Some of his uncles eyed the throne hungrily, while distant cousins whispered about taking the crown by force. Behram Khan did much of the heavy lifting in crushing these threats, but Akbar wasn't just a passive observer. When a rebellion broke out in the Punjab, Akbar insisted on riding to the front lines himself, though Behram Khan reportedly sighed so deeply it could have knocked over a teacup. By the time Akbar was 16, the boy who had tamed an elephant was becoming a man who could command armies. And yet, even as he stood on the cusp of greatness, there was a quiet loneliness to it all. He may have been the emperor, but he was still a teenager, still growing into his robes, and still, in many ways, just a boy trying to make sense of the world. As Akbar matured into his late teens, something unexpected happened. He started collecting people like a kid hoarding shiny marbles, except these weren't toys. These were scholars, warriors, musicians, and, perhaps most curiously, a jester named Birbal. Yes, a real-life jester. Let's start with Birbal, since he's the one who's gotten the most laughs in history books. Birbal wasn't your typical court jester, the kind who just tumbled around in funny hats. No, Birbal was sharp, razor sharp. He had a wit that could slice through any awkward silence, and he wasn't afraid to poke fun at Akbar himself. Imagine being the only guy in a room full of terrified nobles who could roll his eyes when the emperor made a bad joke. You probably wouldn't survive that. Historians still argue whether Birbal was a genius strategist disguised as a funny man, or simply a storyteller who knew how to charm the emperor. Either way, Akbar adored him. The two would spend hours in the palace gardens, swapping riddles and debating everything from taxes to why parrots always seemed so grumpy. But Birbal was just one jewel in Akbar's growing collection of fascinating characters. There was Tansen, the musician whose voice was said to light lamps and bring rain. Akbar once tested this by ordering Tansen to sing in the dark of night. Sure enough, the candles flickered to life. Akbar clapped so hard it said he startled the palace pigeons. Was this story exaggerated by later poets? Of course. But Akbar loved a good tall tale, especially when it involved a bit of magic. Then there were the general's men like Raja Man Singh, a Rajput warrior whose mustache alone could probably scare off an army. Akbar admired Man Singh's loyalty, even if they occasionally clashed over how much gold was too much gold for a wedding feast. And let's not forget Abul Fazl, Akbar's trusted historian and chronicler, who was always scribbling down every little thing Akbar said. As if the emperor's lunch choices might someday change the course of history. Akbar, who could never resist teasing, once quipped that Abul Fazl probably knew more about his life than he did. Akbar's circle, known as the Navratnas, or Nine Jewels, was a curious mix of brilliance and oddball charm. One of them, Faizi, was a poet who could write entire verses without using a single dotted letter. Imagine the poor man's eyes after a week of that. Another, Neon Tansen's rival, tried to outsing him and nearly fainted from the effort. What's fascinating is how Akbar surrounded himself with such a variety of minds. It wasn't just for entertainment, though there was plenty of that. He used these people to test ideas, challenge assumptions, and occasionally, to settle bets. Akbar would ask, how long can a man go without blinking? Or could an elephant be taught to write with a brush? The court would erupt in debate, and Akbar would lean back, smiling, letting the sparks fly. This eclectic group wasn't without its critics. Some conservative scholars grumbled that the court was becoming more of a circus than a serious government. Historians still debate whether Akbar's inner circle helped him rule more wisely or simply distracted him with games. But there's no doubt that Akbar valued loyalty and would over strict formality. He seemed to understand that power wasn't just about armies and taxes, it was also about stories, laughter, and the quiet bonds that held an empire together. In that, perhaps, lies the secret of his enduring charm. By the time Akbar reached his 20s, the empire was no longer just an idea, it was a living, breathing thing. But of course, no empire grows without someone trying to tear it down. And in Akbar's case, the threat came not just from outside enemies, but from within, a rebellion in the 1570s that almost unseated him. You'd think by now the nobles would have learned not to underestimate Akbar. But power makes people bold or foolish, and a group of influential Afghan chieftains decided they weren't too keen on paying taxes or following Akbar's laws. They began stirring up trouble in Bengal, thinking perhaps the young emperor was too distracted with his art collections, elephant duels, and long chats with Birbal to notice. Spoiler: Akbar noticed. The rebellion wasn't small. It spread like a brush fire, with fortresses being seized, local rulers switching sides, and soldiers muttering about whether they were backing the right horse. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine ideological revolt or just a bunch of landowners trying to dodge taxes, but either way, it was messy. Akbar didn't panic. Instead, he packed up his camp, gathered his generals, and this part is classic. Akbar brought along a small library, some painters, and a few musicians for the road. Imagine marching into a rebellion with a caravan of artists trailing behind you. You probably wouldn't survive that. But Akbar had a plan. Rather than rely solely on brute force, he used a mix of diplomacy and military might. He sent envoys to key leaders, promising safe passage and generous gifts if they returned to the fold. Some accepted. Others needed a firmer push, by which I mean a full-on siege. Akbar personally led his forces, often riding at the front, his helmet glinting in the sun. There's a story, though historians debate its accuracy, that during the siege of a rebel fort, Akbar dismounted from his horse, picked up a fallen standard, and waved it to rally his troops. Of course, Akbar's flair for the dramatic wasn't without risk. During one battle, an arrow grazed his cheek, leaving a thin scar. His courtiers begged him to retreat, but Akbar just laughed and said, "A mark of courage suits an emperor." It's a bit of classic royal bravado, but the court loved it. After months of skirmishes, clever negotiations, and more than a few tense tea breaks, the rebellion began to fizzle. The rebel leaders surrendered, swearing loyalty once more, though you can imagine Akbar keeping one eye on them at all times afterward. The empire was safe for now. And in the aftermath, Akbar didn't go on a punishment spree. Instead, he did something unusual. He invited the defeated leaders to court, listened to their grievances, and even restored some of their lands. Some historians praise this as a sign of Akbar's magnanimity. Others argue it was pure strategy, keeping potential enemies close, where he could watch them. Either way, the result was the same: Akbar's grip on power tightened. Meanwhile, Akbar's court grew even more vibrant. After the rebellion, the emperor reportedly threw a grand feast, complete with musicians, dancing girls, and legend has it a contest to see who could tell the funniest joke. Naturally, Birbal won, with a tale about a parrot who learned to insult tax collectors. It was Akbar's way of turning a near disaster into a celebration. After all, what's the point of winning a rebellion if you can't laugh about it afterward? Once the dust from the rebellion settled, Akbar turned his focus to a rather curious project, assembling his Navratnas, the 9 jewels of his court. Now, you've already met a few of them: Birbal the jester, Tansen the musician, and Abul Fazl the chronicler, but the full set of these men was like a box of assorted spices, each with a different flavor. Some sweet, some sharp, and at least one that might make you sneeze. Let's start with Raja Todar Mal, the finance wizard. Todar Mal wasn't just good with numbers, he practically invented a new way of managing land taxes, known as the Zat system. It sounds dry, but stay with me. He measured fields, calculated crop yields, and figured out how much tax each farmer should pay. This system helped stabilize the empire's economy and, believe it or not, it made farmers less likely to rebel, though they still grumbled about taxes, because, well, who doesn't? Then there was Raja Man Singh, the Rajput general with a beard so impressive it could probably stop an arrow mid-flight. He was a fierce warrior and fiercely loyal to Akbar, though they occasionally clashed over, well, everything from military strategy to how much rosewater should be sprinkled at a banquet. There's even a fringe tale that Man Singh once tried to convince Akbar to build a palace shaped like a mango. Did Akbar listen? Not a chance. Faizi, the poet, was another gem in this collection. He had a way with words that could make even a tax report sound like a love letter. Faizi was known for composing verses that avoided using a single dotted letter, which, if you've ever tried writing in Arabic or Persian, you'll know is basically an impossible task. Akbar loved these intellectual tricks, and once challenged Faizi to write an entire poem about pigeons using only words that started with the letter P. It's said Faizi managed it, though it's probably best not to fact-check that one too closely. Then there was Muladu Piazza, a scholar known for his sharp tongue and habit of giving long-winded answers that nobody really asked for. Akbar kept him around partly for his knowledge, and partly, one suspects, for the entertainment value. After all, what's a royal court without a bit of intellectual banter that makes everyone else feel underdressed for the conversation? What made Akbar's 9 jewels truly remarkable was their sheer diversity. He gathered Hindus and Muslims, poets and mathematicians, warriors and philosophers all under one roof, debating, laughing, and occasionally squabbling like a family at a particularly tense dinner party. Some historians argue that this eclectic mix was a stroke of political genius, a way for Akbar to balance competing interests in his vast empire. Others say it was simply his personal curiosity at work, a desire to surround himself with the best minds, no matter where they came from. And, of course, there were the odd little details that make Akbar's court feel so vivid. Birbal once tried to convince Akbar that a man could balance a sugar cube on a needle during a windstorm. Akbar apparently thought about it for a moment, then burst out laughing and ordered more mangoes for everyone. Akbar's 9 jewels weren't just advisors, they were the heartbeat of his court. Together, they created a place where ideas flowed as freely as the rosewater in the fountains. It wasn't always harmonious. There were rivalries, jealousies, and more than a few grumbled complaints about who got the best seat at dinner, but it was, in many ways, a miniature version of Akbar's vision for his empire, diverse, dynamic, and just a little bit quirky. Akbar wasn't content with just building a circle of brilliant minds. He wanted to hear everyone's ideas. That's how his great hall of debates came into being. Picture a grand chamber. They are thick with incense and the scent of fresh palm leaves, sunlight pouring in through latticed windows, and the quiet hum of conversation until, suddenly, someone shouts, "I disagree." And then the real fun begins. Akbar loved debates. He wasn't the kind of emperor who sat in a corner and nodded wisely. He jumped right in, asking questions, poking holes in arguments, and occasionally tossing in a question so strange it left everyone blinking. Like, if a parrot can mimic a human, could a human learn to mimic a parrot so well the parrot would think they were one of its own? Historians still argue whether Akbar was being philosophical or just trying to liven up a slow afternoon. These debates weren't limited to politics. Akbar opened the floor to religious discussions, too, and the topics ranged from the nature of God to whether it was ethical to eat onions on a Friday. Scholars, clerics, and mystics from across the empire were invited, and it wasn't uncommon for a debate to last hours, stretching into the night. The lamps burning low while the participants argued over theology and philosophy. It was in these sessions that Akbar's famous policy of religious tolerance took root. He was fascinated by the similarities and differences between Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Jainism, and even Zoroastrianism. He asked the kind of questions a curious child might ask. Why do you pray this way? Why is this festival so important? Why is your God not also my God? Akbar's open-mindedness wasn't without its critics. Some conservative scholars grumbled that the emperor was blurring the lines between faiths too much. Others whispered that he was becoming too indulgent, letting charlatans and self-proclaimed prophets sway his thinking. There's even a story, though it's a fringe tale, that once, during a particularly heated debate, a scholar accused Akbar of wanting to invent a new religion altogether. Akbar, smiling, reportedly replied, "Perhaps I shall, if you keep arguing so poorly." And so came the Din-i-Ilahi, or faith of God, a kind of spiritual experiment that Akbar proposed, not really a new religion, but more a blend of ethical principles from various faiths. Historians still debate whether Akbar's idea was a genuine attempt at spiritual unity or just a philosophical pastime. Either way, it didn't really catch on, except among a handful of loyal courtiers who, let's be honest, probably joined more out of loyalty than conviction. Meanwhile, Akbar's debates could get surprisingly practical. He once gathered scholars to argue whether eating lentils during the monsoon season was healthy. Another time, he posed the question, could a camel outswim a horse? The debate grew so heated that, according to one fringe account, Akbar actually ordered a swimming contest to test it. Spoiler, The horse one. What's most striking is how Akbar treated these debates not as distractions, but as a form of governance. He believed that by encouraging open dialogue, even on strange topics, he could strengthen the empire. It wasn't just about winning arguments, it was about creating a culture where ideas were valued. Where a scholar from a remote village could stand in the same room as the emperor and have his voice heard. And yes, there were tea breaks. Akbar loved his cardamom-infused tea, and during long debates, servants would glide around the hall, offering tiny cups that steamed in the lamplight. Between sips, the conversations would turn from theology to poetry to whether or not a mango pit could sprout in a salt field. That was Akbar's court, equal parts wisdom, whimsy, and a touch of madness. While Akbar's debates filled the court with talk, his actual policies reshaped the lives of millions. And some of those policies, well, they were a bit unusual. Akbar had a knack for making rules that left even his advisors scratching their heads, wondering if he was a visionary, a prankster, or both. Take the case of the beard tax. Yes, a beard tax. For a brief period, Akbar considered taxing men based on the size and style of their facial hair. The bigger the beard, the higher the tax. The logic. Some say it was Akbar's way of encouraging modesty, or perhaps he simply found long beards a bit too scratchy for his taste. Historians still argue whether this was a serious attempt at revenue or just a clever way to get courtiers to stop stroking their beards during meetings. And then there was the no meat on certain days rule. Akbar, who dabbled in vegetarianism now and then, decreed that for specific days of the week, no animals could be slaughtered across the empire. This wasn't just a health kick, it was partly inspired by Jain philosophy and Akbar's growing fascination with nonviolence. Of course, enforcing this policy across such a vast empire was tricky. You can imagine the grumbling in kitchens and market stalls, as cooks tried to whip up meatless feasts and butchers stared glumly at empty hooks. One of Akbar's quirkiest decrees was the public weighing of the emperor. Once a year, Akbar would sit on an enormous scale and be weighed against sacks of grain, gold, and sometimes even spices. The goods were then distributed to the poor. It was a grand spectacle. Imagine a royal seesaw creaking under the emperor's weight while courtiers fanned themselves nervously. You probably wouldn't survive sitting that still for so long, but Akbar seemed to enjoy it, grinning as children scrambled for the grain spilling onto the ground. Akbar also tinkered with the calendar. He introduced a new solar calendar, the Tarikh-i-Ilahi, blending Persian and Indian elements. Historians debate whether this was a practical reform or just another of Akbar's experiments. Either way, it never fully caught on. Most people went right back to the old lunar system once the emperor's gaze turned elsewhere. There were also laws aimed at curbing excess. Akbar once banned child marriage, a move that angered many conservative families but won him quiet support among reformers. He limited the number of wives a man could have unless he could prove he could care for them equally. And he even passed rules to ensure fair treatment of prisoners, decreeing that jails should have proper ventilation and access to water, an idea so basic you'd think it would be obvious. But in those days, it was almost revolutionary. And yet, not all of Akbar's laws were serious. One fringe tale, likely exaggerated but too good not to mention, claims that he once banned the use of red shoes in court after a noble's particularly shiny pair distracted him during a meeting. Whether true or not, it fits the pattern of Akbar's rule, part practicality, part whimsy, and always full of surprises. What shines through in all these odd laws is Akbar's restless mind. He wasn't content to simply sit on a throne and issue commands. He wanted to experiment, to test ideas, to see how small changes could ripple across his empire. Sometimes those ripples turned into waves, sometimes they fizzled out. But Akbar kept trying, and in the process, he left behind a legacy of reform that still makes historians tilt their heads and say, wait, he did what? For all his grand debates and quirky laws, Akbar had one area of his life that fascinated his courtiers and probably confused them too: his eating habits. The emperor's diet wasn't just a matter of personal taste, it became a reflection of his curiosity, his beliefs, and maybe even his sense of humor. Let's start with the basics. Akbar's meals weren't the typical mule feasts overflowing with roasted meats and mountains of rice. Sure, he loved a good biryani now and then, but he also dabbled in vegetarianism, sometimes going for weeks without touching a morsel of meat. Historians still debate whether this was out of spiritual interest or just one of Akbar's many experiments. After all, this is the man who once tried to breed pigeons that could carry tiny letters across the empire. Akbar's kitchen was a world of its own, massive, chaotic, and full of exotic scents. Cooks bustled around enormous copper pots, grinding spices into fragrant pastes, while kitchen boys darted between the flames, carrying bowls of pomegranate seeds and slivers of almond. The emperor was known to enjoy dishes like spiced lentil stews, yogurt with rosewater, and rice puddings so sweet they'd make your teeth ache just thinking about them. But it wasn't just the food itself that fascinated people, it was the way Akbar treated meals as a kind of social experiment. He would often invite travelers and scholars from far-off lands to dine with him, sometimes asking them to prepare a dish from their homeland. Imagine the scene, a Portuguese priest trying to explain how to bake a custard tart while an Indian cook furiously pounds turmeric in the background. One French visitor described Akbar's meals as a bewildering mix of flavors and philosophies. You probably wouldn't survive trying to guess what dish would show up on the table next. And then there were the really strange moments. One story tells of a dinner where Akbar insisted on blindfolding the courtiers, just to see if they could identify the spices by smell alone. Another tale claims he once tried a fasting experiment where he ate nothing but mangoes for 3 days, though by then, he supposedly admitted he was dreaming of roasted lamb. Akbar also had some peculiar ideas about health. He believed that eating small amounts of poison could build up immunity, a theory called Mithridatism. So, he reportedly took tiny doses of various toxins just to strengthen the body. Whether this worked or not is still debated, though it's said that Akbar never shied away from a spicy curry, even one that made other diners sweat through their robes. And then there's the fringe tale that Akbar, once during a particularly hot summer, ordered an entire feast to be prepared using only cooling ingredients: cucumber soups, mint chutneys, and chilled rosewater drinks. The courtiers, dressed in their heavy brocades, sweated through the meal, while Akbar grinned under a shady pavilion, fanning himself with a peacock feather. What's clear is that Akbar's dining table wasn't just a place for food, it was a laboratory, a stage, and sometimes a game. He used meals to learn about the world, to build bridges with guests, and occasionally, just to have a little fun. And really, who wouldn't want to dine at a table where a discussion about the ethics of onion consumption might lead to a mango tasting competition? When Akbar wasn't debating theology or testing how many mangoes a person could eat in a day, he was building things. Big things, palaces, mosques, forts. If it could be drawn on a scroll and imagined in the mind's eye, Akbar wanted it built. You could say he was a bit of an architecture addict. His favorite project, Fatehpur Sikri, the grand city he dreamed up almost like a child building a sandcastle, except this was a sandcastle made of red sandstone and ambition. Akbar loved red sandstone. He thought it had a warmth, a kind of cozy glow when the sun hit it just right. So, his architects laid out the city in broad, geometric patterns, with courtyards that seemed to stretch forever, and halls where echoes would play tricks on the ear. But Fatehpur Sikri wasn't the only thing Akbar obsessed over. Every few years, he'd get an idea stuck in his head like a song you can't stop humming, and suddenly, a new palace wing would sprout up, an agra or a mosque would rise on the horizon. He had a soft spot for high domes and towering gates, the kind that made visitors crane their necks and mutter, "Well, I wasn't expecting that." Historians still argue whether Akbar's building frenzy was part of a grand imperial strategy or just a way to keep his mind busy. After all, he wasn't the kind of ruler who liked to sit still. His mind raced from one idea to the next, and often, those ideas found their way into bricks and mortar. Some of Akbar's architectural quirks were ahead of their time. He insisted on wide courtyards for public gatherings, probably because he liked hearing people's opinions, even if they weren't always flattering. He also introduced a kind of early air conditioning, long channels of water flowing through the buildings, cooling the air with their gentle trickle. The courtiers probably appreciated it, too, especially during those long, sweaty debates about whether cucumbers were medicinal or just delicious. And then there were the odd little details. Akbar loved hidden passages, secret staircases that twisted behind walls, tiny balconies where he could eavesdrop on conversations, and trapdoors that led to underground chambers. Whether he used them for security, mischief, or simply because they made life more interesting, we'll never really know. You probably wouldn't survive getting lost in one of those tunnels, but Akbar seemed to love the thrill. One of his most whimsical designs was the Panch Mahal at Fatehpur Sikri, a 5-story pavilion with columns so slender it looked like it could topple over in a breeze. It didn't, of course, and Akbar would often sit there in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky in dusty pinks and golds. Not all his buildings were grand. Akbar also ordered the construction of smaller, more personal spaces, gardens filled with fragrant jasmine, shaded courtyards where he could drink cardamom tea in peace, and even a special enclosure for his beloved pigeons. It's said he could spend hours there, watching them flutter and coo, while the affairs of state buzzed outside. Akbar's love for building wasn't just about leaving a mark on the landscape. It was about creating spaces where ideas could breathe. He wanted his palaces to be places where poets could compose verses, where musicians could play their sitars without fear, and where a lowly cook could argue with a scholar about the proper way to peel a mango. And through it all, Akbar's architects scrambled to keep up, drafting plans, hauling stones, and occasionally sighing when the emperor changed his mind halfway through a project. But they also knew they were part of something bigger, a vision of an empire built not just on power, but on curiosity, creativity, and a touch of whimsy. Akbar's love affair with architecture reached its peak with Fatehpur Sikri, the city that rose from the red dust like a dream and, in some ways, faded just as quickly. Fatehpur Sikri was Akbar's passion project, built in the 1570s as a tribute to a Sufi saint named Salim Chishti, whose blessing was said to have helped Akbar finally have a son. And when an emperor thinks someone helped him produce an heir, well, you can bet there's going to be a lot of marble and fancy carvings involved. Fatehpur Sikri wasn't just a palace, it was a whole city: mosques, gardens, public squares, and even a special hall for debates. Akbar wanted it to be the perfect blend of form and function, a place where philosophy could be discussed over cups of sweet lassi and where musicians could perform under the stars. He ordered that the entire city be built from warm red sandstone, as if he wanted it to glow in the evening light. But the details, oh, the details. There were yali screens, those intricate lattice windows that let in the breeze but kept out the sun's glare. There were pavilions that seemed to float above the courtyards, supported by columns so slender you'd swear they were made of spun sugar. And there was the Grand Bulan Darwaza, a gate so tall that it seemed to scrape the sky, making visitors feel like tiny ants as they walked beneath its arches. Historians still debate why Akbar chose to build Fatehpur Sikri in that particular spot. Some say it was purely to honor Salim Chishti, others argue it was a strategic location for trade routes. And then there's the fringe theory that Akbar simply fell in love with the landscape: the red hills, the soft breeze, the way the air smelled after the monsoon rains. But here's the twist: despite all the grandeur, Fatehpur Sikri didn't last. Just a few years after it was built, Akbar and his court packed up and left. Why? That's the million-rupee question. Some say it was due to water shortages. There's a tale that the wells ran dry, though historians still argue about the evidence. Others suggest political reasons, or perhaps Akbar just got restless. After all, this was a man who once tried to race camels against horses just to see who'd win. And what became of the city after the emperor left? Well, that's where things get a bit spooky. Fatehpur Sikri became a kind of ghost town, its courtyards slowly filling with drifting sand and its palaces echoing with the calls of pigeons. Local villagers whispered that the place was cursed, that no ruler could stay there long without falling into ruin. Of course, pigeons don't care much for curses. They moved in, cooing and flapping their wings in the empty halls. And there's something almost poetic about that: Akbar's grand vision, slowly reclaimed by nature and a flock of birds who probably didn't care one bit about yali screens or royal debates. Today, when you walk through Fatehpur Sikri, you can almost hear the whispers of the past, the footsteps of courtiers rushing to meetings, the soft pluck of a sitar drifting on the breeze, and maybe even the sound of Akbar himself, laughing as he watched the pigeons scatter from the palace walls. While Akbar's empire seemed like a shining jewel, inside the Mule Palace walls, family life was, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a peaceful dinner table every night. Akbar had a complicated family: jealous sons, loyal wives, scheming cousins, and more than a few mysteries that still make historians scratch their heads. First, the sons. Akbar's relationship with his children was far from a warm father-son picnic in the gardens. His eldest son, Salim, later known as Jahangir, was the most famous of the lot, but not always for the best reasons. Salim had a reputation for being rebellious, impatient, and fond of wine, lots of wine. Akbar tried to guide him, but the two often clashed, with Salim sometimes refusing to attend court, and Akbar responding by pretending it didn't bother him, but everyone could tell it did. Historians still debate whether Akbar's strict expectations pushed Salim to rebel, or if Salim simply wanted to carve out his own identity. One fringe story claims that Salim once tried to poison his father in a fit of frustration, though whether this was a real attempt or just a whispered rumor in the smoky corners of the court remains a mystery. Then there were the wives. Akbar had several, as was common for a mule emperor, but not all were mere decorations in his court. His Hindu wife, Maryam-uz-Zamani, often called Jyotibai in later stories, was one of his closest confidants and the mother of Salim. She had her own court, her own income, and even her own fleet of trading ships. Imagine that, a mule queen running a shipping business. You probably wouldn't survive trying to out-negotiate her. But family life wasn't all business. There were the quieter, stranger moments too. Akbar was known to enjoy spending time with the women of the harem, not just as an emperor, but as a listener. He'd sit for hours, hearing their stories, their worries, their dreams. It's said he sometimes disguised himself as an ordinary noble and wandered the palace, eavesdropping to hear what people really thought of him. A risky game, but Akbar loved a good bit of mischief. And let's not forget the palace intrigues, plots, and whispers that flitted through the air like moths on a lamp. When a sudden illness or an untimely death occurred, the court would murmur, was it an accident, poison, divine punishment? Historians still argue over the death of Daniel, Akbar's youngest son. Some say it was alcohol, others hint at darker forces, and a few just throw up their hands and admit that palace life was a tangled web no one could fully unravel. Akbar, for all his wisdom, couldn't keep his family in perfect harmony. And perhaps, in a way, that's comforting. Even the greatest emperor of the mule world had to deal with teenage tantrums, family feuds, and the occasional case of why is my cousin suddenly acting so friendly. Yet, through it all, Akbar managed to hold the empire together. Maybe it was his charm, or maybe it was the fact that, when push came to shove, he could still stare down an elephant and a rebellious son with the same steady gaze. If you thought Akbar's family life was complicated, wait until you hear about his obsession with astrology. This man, who could command armies and rewrite laws, also believed that the stars could reveal his destiny and yours too, if you happened to cross his path at the wrong time. Akbar's fascination with astrology wasn't just a passing hobby. He took it seriously. He consulted astrologers before major decisions like when to declare war, when to hold a festival, and, yes, even when to trim his beard. There's a tale historians still argue whether it's entirely true that Akbar once delayed a military campaign for 3 whole days because the court astrologer said the moon was in the wrong phase. His generals must have been fuming, polishing their swords while Akbar calmly sipped tea and gazed at the stars. The emperor also had a habit of asking strange, cosmic questions. Like, could the position of Venus explain why his parrot refused to talk on certain days? Or did Mars make camels more stubborn in the monsoon season? These questions might sound silly now, but in Akbar's court, no question was too odd. You probably wouldn't survive rolling your eyes at one of his astrology musings, but Birbal might have gotten away with it. Akbar even had a special room in the palace, part observatory, part lounge, where scholars would chart the stars while sipping sherbet. He'd wander in, look at the swirling constellations painted on the ceiling, and ask if Jupiter was still being grumpy this month. His courtiers, some of whom were secretly skeptical, would nod solemnly and pretend they hadn't just overheard Akbar muttering about how Capricorn has terrible table manners. But astrology wasn't just for fun. Akbar genuinely believed the stars shaped his fate and the empire's. He encouraged his ministers to consult astrological charts before big decisions, and there are records of him matching the dates of royal weddings to favorable planetary alignments. Some scholars argue that Akbar's interest in astrology was part of his larger quest to understand the universe, a way of blending science, spirituality, and a bit of showmanship. Others think he just liked the idea of having cosmic permission slips for his bold choices. And let's not forget the fringe stories. One claims that Akbar once tried to summon rain by staging a massive astrology ceremony complete with dancers dressed as clouds, musicians playing thunder like drums, and priests chanting to the sky. It didn't work, of course. But Akbar, ever the optimist, reportedly laughed and said, "Well, at least we tried." Some in the court, like Abul Fazl, supported Akbar's astrological interests, weaving them into the grand narrative of his reign. Others grumbled that the emperor was spending too much time stargazing and not enough time on practical governance. Historians still debate whether Akbar's astrology habit made him a better ruler by teaching patience and humility, or whether it was just an indulgence that occasionally slowed down important decisions. What's clear is that Akbar's belief in the stars wasn't just about predicting the future. It was about finding patterns in the chaos, searching for meaning in a world that could be as unpredictable as an elephant in the courtyard. And in that, perhaps, Akbar wasn't so different from the rest of us trying to make sense of life's strange twists, one star chart at a time. As Akbar grew older, the restless energy that had once driven him to race elephants and redesign entire cities began to settle into a quieter, more reflective rhythm. But even in his later years, Akbar remained Akbar, always a mix of wisdom, curiosity, and just a hint of mischief. And like so many great figures in history, his final days were filled with omens, strange occurrences, and the lingering question, did he see the end coming? The records tell us that in his final months, Akbar wasn't quite himself. He grew more withdrawn, sometimes gazing for hours at the horizon as if searching for something only he could see. Some say he spent more time in the gardens, sitting under the shade of tamarind trees, listening to the pigeons coo and watching the play of light on the sandstone walls. There's a story, one of those tales historians love to debate, that in his last year, Akbar had a vivid dream. In it, he was surrounded by a sea of white birds, their wings beating softly as they lifted him into the sky. He reportedly told a courtier the next morning, "I saw the empire from above. It is vast, but smaller than a feather in the wind." Whether this was poetic reflection or the effects of a mild fever, no one knows for sure. Signs and portents seemed to cling to his final months. There were sudden storms that swept across the plains, strong winds that rattled palace doors, and a strange eclipse that had the court astrologers whispering nervously in corners. Akbar himself, usually eager to discuss such things, seemed less interested in interpreting the stars. When asked what the eclipse meant, he simply smiled and said, "The sun must rest, as must we all." And then there were the whispers about a strange falcon that perched near his chamber window for 3 nights in a row. In mule symbolism, the falcon often represented imperial power, so when the bird finally flew away, some said it was an omen that the emperor's time had come to an end. Akbar, for his part, didn't seem afraid. He told those around him, "Life is a borrowed flame. When it dims, it is only right to let it fade." Historians still argue over the details of Akbar's death in 1605. Some accounts say he passed quietly, surrounded by loyal courtiers and family. Others hint at tension, rivalries brewing over who would take the throne next, and a subtle, shifting atmosphere in the palace. What we do know is that Akbar's last days were marked by a sense of calm detachment, as though he had made peace with the empire he had built and the legacy he would leave behind. The boy who once wrestled an elephant, the emperor who debated scholars, the ruler who tried to blend faiths into one tapestry, he was, in the end, just a man watching the sunset, listening to the soft coo of pigeons, and waiting for the inevitable. Long after Akbar took his final breath, his presence lingered in the empire like the scent of sandalwood on warm air, subtle but everywhere. His legacy didn't fade with the setting sun, it grew, a collection of stories, buildings, and whispered legends that painted a picture of a ruler both larger than life and deeply, imperfectly human. His son Salim, who took the throne as Jahangir, had a complicated relationship with his father's memory. Some say he tried to walk in Akbar's footsteps, upholding his policies of tolerance and reform. Others argue that Jahangir chafed under the weight of Akbar's legacy, eager to assert his own vision. Historians still debate whether Akbar's shadow helped or hindered Jahangir's rule, but either way, the empire Akbar built held steady for a while, at least. Akbar's influence wasn't confined to politics or architecture. His life became the stuff of legends, retold in stories passed down through generations. There were paintings that captured his likeness, stern but somehow kind-eyed, and books like the Akbar, carefully recording the events of his reign, though let's be honest, they probably made him look a bit more perfect than he really was. You probably wouldn't survive the temptation to exaggerate a little if you were writing about a king who once rode an elephant into a battle. After all, artists depicted him as the ideal king, wise, just, and open-minded. Folk tales grew around him, how he loved mangoes so much he once ordered an entire orchard planted overnight, or how he could name every star in the sky by heart. Even today, Akbar is remembered as the philosopher king, a rare blend of might and mind, someone who could win a war but also stop in the middle of a march to discuss the shape of a raindrop. Akbar's legacy also lives on in India's architectural wonders, the Grand Fort at Agra, the still-standing Buland Darwaza at Fatehpur Sikri, and the quiet, haunting beauty of the Panch Mahal, where you can still hear the wind sighing through the empty columns. And then there are the quiet places, gardens where pigeons still strut, perhaps the descendants of Akbar's own flock, and old courtyards where the scent of cardamom tea lingers. In these places, if you close your eyes, you might almost hear the echoes of Akbar's court, bursts of laughter from Birbal, the steady hum of a debate, the soft pluck of a sitar drifting through the evening air. Of course, not all of Akbar's experiments and ideas lasted. His Din-i-Ilahi faith faded after his death. His tax reforms were tweaked by later rulers, and his calendars went back to the old ways. But the spirit of what Akbar tried to do, building bridges between people, ideas, and cultures, remains a guiding light for many who study his life. In the end, Akbar was more than just a ruler. He was a seeker, a man who, for all his power, never stopped asking questions. And maybe that's the real reason his story still speaks to us today. Because even the greatest emperors are just people trying to make sense of the world, one mango, one elephant, and one star at a time. Now, as you ease into sleep, imagine the warm glow of red sandstone under a fading sun, the soft coo of pigeons echoing through a quiet courtyard. Picture Akbar, sitting beneath the shade of a tamarind tree, watching the world unfold with a curious smile, one hand resting on a hilt, the other lightly tracing the patterns in the dust. The sounds of the court fade away, replaced by the steady hum of the evening breeze and the gentle whispers of stories left behind. Let your thoughts drift with the wind, knowing that empires may rise and fall, but stories like these, stories of courage, curiosity, and the simple joys of mangoes and starlight, linger quietly in the corners of history, waiting to be found again. So breathe deep, let your body relax, and allow the soft rhythms of the past to carry you into sleep. There's no rush here, no need to think about the details, just the quiet comfort of knowing that someone, long ago, once asked if a camel could outswim a horse, and smiled at the possibility. Good night, and sweet dreams.